James Dalton was the kind of man who rarely looked away from his phone. As CEO of a Fortune 500 company, his mornings were tightly packed with emails, charts, and back-to-back meetings. That morning, stuck at a red light in his sleek black car, he barely noticed the cold outside, until something tugged at his attention. A little girl stood quietly at the corner. No shouting, no outstretched hands, just a thin figure clutching a cardboard sign and staring at the ground. She looked about 7, her oversized hoodie swallowing her small frame. James took another sip of his espresso, glancing at his tablet, but his eyes kept returning to her. Something wasn't right. There was no adult nearby, and the usual urgency of panhandling was missing. She just stood there, still, like she was waiting for something, or someone. The light turned green. Horns behind him honked impatiently. He almost pressed the gas, but then the girl stepped closer to his window. Her voice was barely audible over the city noise, yet it stopped James cold. "Sir, she's too weak to beg now." For a moment, James froze. He slowly rolled down his window, unsure if he heard her right. The girl didn't ask for money. She didn't even look scared. She looked worried. And tired. Deeply tired, like she carried a weight far too heavy for her tiny shoulders. James felt something unfamiliar stir inside him, something that couldn't be ignored by status or spreadsheets. Compassion. Curiosity. And a quiet urgency to find out more. James leaned out of his car window, his voice low and cautious. "Who's too weak to beg?" he asked. The little girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed a trembling finger toward a rusted, beat-up sedan parked beside a dumpster just a few feet away. Its windows were fogged up, and the back bumper hung by a thread. Her eyes welled with quiet desperation as she whispered, "My sister, she's in the trunk. It's the only place that's warm." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "In the trunk," he repeated, stunned. She nodded. For a man used to corporate negotiations and boardroom power plays, this moment was disorienting. He parked the car hastily, stepping out onto the icy sidewalk. Pedestrians passed by, wrapped in coats and indifference, not noticing the scene unfolding. The little girl led him to the old car. Its trunk was slightly ajar, a tattered towel stuffed along the edge to keep out the cold. James hesitated, then lifted the trunk lid gently. Inside lay a teenage girl, barely conscious, curled into herself under a thin, dirty blanket. Her skin was pale, lips tinged blue. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, like each breath was a struggle. James couldn't move. Couldn't speak. The sight struck something deep within him, something raw and human. The little girl's voice broke the silence, trembling, "Please don't call anyone who'll take us away, we just wanted to stay together." And in that moment, James realized this was no ordinary decision, this was a test of who he truly was. James stood frozen, staring into the trunk. The teenager inside looked lifeless, her face gaunt, her fingers curled tightly around a worn-out teddy bear. A part of him wanted to believe this wasn't real. That he'd misheard the girl. That someone else, anyone else, would step in. But there was no one. Just the sharp bite of winter air and two sisters who had slipped through every crack in the system. The little girl tugged at his coat. "She didn't eat yesterday. Or the day before. I gave her all I had," she said, her voice breaking with guilt instead of fear. James's thoughts spun. He had spent millions on boardroom remodels, corporate retreats, and holiday bonuses. But in this moment, none of it mattered. Not his status. Not his wealth. Only the fragile girl in the trunk and her brave little sister trying to keep her alive. Without another word, he gently lifted the older girl into his arms. She was shockingly light, her body limp and cold. The younger sister followed silently, clutching her sign like it was her last possession. James laid the teen across the back seat of his luxury car, turned the heat all the way up, and hit the gas toward the nearest hospital. He had no plan, no answers, only a sudden, burning urgency to help. As the city blurred past his windshield, he looked at the little girl beside him and said softly, "You're not alone anymore." She didn't answer. But for the first time, she leaned against him and closed her eyes. Hours later, James sat in the sterile quiet of the hospital waiting room. His phone buzzed with missed calls and emails, but he ignored them all. His world, once filled with deadlines and profit margins, had narrowed down to the pale face of a teenage girl behind those ER doors, and the little sister sitting beside him, wrapped in a hospital blanket, cradling a juice box. Doctors had rushed the older girl into treatment for severe hypothermia and malnutrition. One of them had pulled James aside, whispering that if she'd been found just a few hours later, she might not have made it. Now, as the fluorescent lights flickered above him, James turned to the younger girl. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lila," she said, barely audible. "My sister's name is Marcy." "Where's your family, Lila?" She looked down. "Our mom died last winter. We tried to stay in the shelter, but it was full. We got scared they'd split us up if we told anyone." James was silent. He had spent years making the right deals, building his empire, chasing success. But nothing he had ever done felt as real as this moment. Two little girls, abandoned by the world, had shown up at his car window, and changed everything. He reached over, took her small hand, and said with quiet certainty, "You're safe now. Both of you. I promise." And for the first time since he met her, Lila smiled. Just a little. But it was real, and it was enough. Weeks later, the world looked very different for James Dalton. Instead of morning meetings in a high-rise office, he now found himself standing at the door of a modest but warm apartment, holding a small box wrapped in holiday paper. Lila opened the door with a grin, her hair clean, her cheeks rosy. Behind her, Marcy sat on the couch, healthy and alert, a soft blanket around her shoulders and a textbook in her lap. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was safe, filled with light, food, and something James hadn't seen in their eyes before, hope. He stepped inside, greeted by the smell of something baking and the sound of laughter, a sound he'd never heard from them before. A caseworker nodded to him from the kitchen, grateful and still a little stunned by how personally involved he'd stayed. James hadn't just covered their medical bills. He'd found them a home, enrolled them in school, and set up a trust in their name. He even created a new division in his company focused on supporting homeless youth. As he placed the gift box on the table, Lila ran up and hugged him tightly. "You didn't forget us," she whispered. James knelt down and smiled. "You saved your sister's life. I'll never forget that." Marcy stood slowly and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You gave us back a future," she said softly. James looked around, at the warmth, the life, the second chances, and felt a fullness in his chest he'd never known before. For once, success wasn't measured in numbers, but in love, dignity, and the quiet power of simply seeing someone. And that was more than enough.